The Red Book of Hergest is the best known and probably the most important of all the manuscripts of Jesus College. It's also the largest single medieval manuscript collection of Welsh literature and history. The Red Book is also varied in content. It contains both prose and poetry. What's more, the poetry ranges over several centuries, from about the 9th century through to the date of its writing, about 1400. It includes several different genres. And the prose has both history and imaginative literature. For that reason, because it has so much in it, it's so big and so varied, all the early students of medieval literature from the 16th century onwards have wanted to use, consult, and probably in some cases to acquire, if only they could, the Red Book of Hergest. And that's true from Sir John Price of Brecon in the 16th century, whose manuscripts subsequently were given by one of his sons to Jesus College and formed the biggest early collection of the college's manuscripts. The Red Book, however, was not one of them. Sir John Price did not own the book, he just consulted it and annotated it. Another user later was Edward Llwyd, who was a member of the college and a great antiquarian and linguist, the second keeper of the Ashmolean. He didn't acquire it, he borrowed it for quite some time. And when he died, the college had some difficulty in getting back the manuscript. And that's, when it finally arrived in the early 18th century. The Red Book, apart from a few additions, was written by 3 scribes, and they are known as A, B, and C. And B contributed most of the text. Unfortunately, we know who he was. So we know the identity of the patron, and we know the identity of at least one, and indeed the main one, of the scribes. The identity of the scribe, funnily enough, was detected by a former National Librarian of Wales, Brynley Roberts, as a result of a visit by another person from the National Library to America. And he saw there a manuscript in Philadelphia, which was also written by Hand B, the main scribe of the Red Book of Hergest. And in the Philadelphia manuscript, our Hand B identified himself as Hywel Vychan ap Hywel Goch of Buellt, namely the district round Builth Wells in the middle of Wales. The likely patron had already been identified as a man called Hopkin ap Thomas, who lived near Swansea at the end of the 14th century, probably died in the first years of the 15th. And he was a learned patron with interests in a whole variety of Welsh antiquities. The heirs of Hopkin lost the Red Book of Hergest, amongst other possessions indeed, to another family, the Vaughans of Tretar in Breconshire, as a result of being on the defeated side in the Wars of the Roses. And as a result, the manuscript went to Tretar in Breconshire, and then to another branch of the same family at Hergest. Hergest is just on the border between England and Wales, between Herefordshire and Radnorshire. That's where, of course, it acquired the name of the Red Book of Hergest, red because it was bound in red leather. A relic of its time at Tretar is on folios 353 verso and 354 recto, where a poet of the 15th century, Lewis Glyn Cothi, a well-known Welsh poet, has added poems to the manuscript in praise of Sir Thomas, son of Sir Roger Vaughan, and Sir Thomas's sons. So that's, a little impression of where it was at that time. Later, it passed, by inheritance probably, to the Mansells of Margam, that's in Glamorgan, a family who were notable benefactors of Jesus College in the early days. It was there until Thomas Wilkins, in the end of the 17th century, borrowed it. He lived near Cowbridge, Cowbridge being where Cowbridge Grammar School is, which is closely connected with the college through Sir Leoline Jenkins. He was sort of rector of a church just by Cowbridge. Presumably, he bought it. I don't actually know the details of this, because in 1701, his son, another Thomas Wilkins, gave it to Jesus College. So that's when it arrives in Jesus. Some members of the college did actually consult the Red Book in the 18th century, so there is good evidence for that. It wasn't that it just sort of sat in Jesus College Library gathering dust. As I said before, the Red Book is remarkable for its range of contents, and these fall to three main sections. There are three scribes, three main sections. The first section is the traditional history of the Welsh and the Britons, beginning in Troy and ending in 1282. And this section comes first in the manuscript, and it was also the section written, apart from a few additions, by the first scribe, Scribe A. A second major section of the manuscript is devoted to prose narrative. This section mingles together what are sometimes known as the native tales with the Welsh Arthurian romances and other texts. The only group of these tales, as presented as a group by the manuscript, is what it called a Mabinogi, and this consisted of the four branches of the Mabinogi. This whole section was written by Hand B, namely Hywel Vychan. The third main section consisted of poetry, and first came a collection of early English poetry, some of it recently edited by Nicholas Jacobs, a long-serving fellow and tutor of the college. The final portion of the Red Book, however, is devoted to poetry of the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries, prefixed by a copy of a grammar for poets, ascribed very probably correctly to a man called Einion of Heriad, a priest active in southwest Wales in the early 14th century. In the Red Book, the grammar is presented as an introduction to the poetry that then follows. And it implies, since it comes after the old poetry, what they called Hergest, old poetry, and before the poetry of the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, it implies a distinction between those two. According to the editor of a poem by Dafydd y Coed, which is a satire on the town of Llandovery, to which both scribes B and C contribute, it's a single poem, even though there's a change of hand. There you see two poets working together as far as we can see. Up to now, everything looks reasonably tidy. History, non-historical prose, narrative, and finally, poetry. But there's an interesting mismatch between prose and poetry. The prose presents an image of the Welsh past, all the way from Troy in remote antiquity to 1282, Edward I's conquest of North Wales. 1282 seems to be the end of the independent power, or semi-independent power, of these heirs of Troy. Another manuscript collection of poetry has the same endpoint. That seems to be it. But the Red Book goes on. In past 1282, the poetry, right up to the time of Hopkyn ap Thomas himself, the Welsh gentry of the 14th century, so the poetry implies, were the heirs of those earlier Welsh kings and princes, and even of the city of Troy itself.